At Garrett Mercer's wedding feast, 200 guests fell silent when the most powerful woman in the territory stood up and claimed credit for every dish on the table. Every roasted cut of beef, every golden loaf, every perfect layer of that breathtaking three-tier cake. The crowd erupted in applause. Champagne glasses clinked. And somewhere in the back of that magnificent hall, hidden behind a kitchen door, a flour-dusted widow in a faded apron listened to another woman take a bow for the hardest week of her life. What happened next would tear apart the most powerful engagement Red Creek Crossing had ever seen, and nobody in that territory would forget it for the rest of their lives. If you want to know what she did, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see just how far this story travels. The morning Clara Hawthorne buried her husband, it rained so hard the preacher had to shout over the sound of water hammering the wooden caskets nearby. There were maybe 11 people at the graveside. A few neighbors, the dry goods man who had extended Thomas credit for too long, and old May Briggs from 2 farms over, who brought a pan of cornbread wrapped in a cloth, because that was what May Briggs did when she didn't know what else to do. Clara stood at the edge of the hole in the ground and did not cry. Not because she didn't want to, not because she was strong in the way people later said she was strong. She didn't cry because she was doing math in her head. $31 left in the coffee tin above the stove. The roof had needed fixing since March. The horse was old enough that one bad winter might take him. The flour supply would last maybe 3 weeks if she was careful, and careful was the only way she knew how to be anymore. Thomas Hawthorne had been a good man, a quiet man. The kind of man who came in at dusk with mud on his boots and didn't complain about supper, even when supper was thin. He had never once raised his voice to her. He had loved her in the modest, undemonstrating way of men raised on the frontier, where affection was shown through mended fences and full woodpiles rather than words. She had respected him for it. She had, in her own way, loved him back. But the fever had taken him in 9 days flat, and now Clara was 26 years old, living alone on 40 acres of stubborn Wyoming prairie with $31 and a roof that leaked. She turned away from the grave before the dirt hit the coffin. There was bread that needed tending. Poter. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of 7-day weeks. 3 years of rising before the sun had any business being up, of mixing dough by lamplight, of hauling water and feeding fires and learning, through sheer repetition and occasional disaster, how to turn raw flour and salt and the labor of her own hands into something people would pay for. She started small, neighbors first, then the family at the trading post, then the saloon cook who didn't want to deal with pastry. Word moved the way word always moved in small settlements, slowly, then all at once. By the time the third winter came, Clara had a modest reputation in Red Creek Crossing. Nothing grand, nobody called her famous. But if you needed bread, real bread, the kind with a crust that cracked right, or a pie that didn't taste like sweetened paste, or a meal that could anchor a table for a working family, you found Clara Hawthorne. It was enough to keep the roof fixed. Barely enough, but enough. She had learned to measure her life in what was enough. The notice appeared on the trading post board on a Tuesday in late September. Clara almost walked past it. She had come for salt and a new pair of work gloves. Her old ones had worn through at the palms again, and she was not in the habit of reading notices unless they concerned her directly. But the name at the bottom stopped her cold. Mercer Ranch. Inquiries to be directed to Mr. Garrett Mercer or his household staff. Garrett Mercer. She stood there in the cold morning air and read the notice 3 times. Mercer Ranch needed a cook for a private engagement. Not just a cook. A head preparer for a formal wedding feast. 200 guests. Multiple courses. A 3-tiered celebration cake. 7 days of preparation, the week before the ceremony. Compensation upon completion. The number written at the bottom made Clara's heart do something uncomfortable. It was 3 times what she made in her best month. She copied the number down on the inside of her wrist with a stub of pencil and walked home thinking about the roof. Thinking about the debt she still owed the lumber merchant. Thinking about the horse's bad knee and the way the kitchen door had started sticking in the cold. She did not think about Garrett Mercer specifically. She thought about the money. That was what sensible women in her position did. They thought about the money, and they put everything else aside, and they went and spoke to whoever they needed to speak to. She went the next morning. Mercer Ranch sat at the edge of the best grazing land in the county, which was not an accident. 3 generations of Mercers had built the place up from a single cabin into something that qualified out here as impressive. A sprawling main house with a proper porch, bunkhouses for the hands, a separate barn for breeding stock, and enough fenced pasture to make men who had been here longer quietly envious. Clara had been out this way once before, years back, delivering pies to a harvest gathering. She remembered the size of the kitchen. She remembered thinking, if I had a kitchen like that, I could do things. She rode in on the old horse, careful with his knee on the uneven ground, and was met at the side entrance by a short, broad-shouldered woman named Rosalie, who turned out to be the ranch's permanent housekeeper, and who looked at Clara the way someone looks at a job applicant they're already mildly suspicious of. Mr. Mercer said to see him directly, Rosalie said without warmth. You the widow from the crossing? Clara Hawthorne, Claire said. Right, come on then. She was taken, not through the front of the house, but around to a sitting room off the kitchen. It was a practical room. Chairs without cushions, a table that had been worked at, a window looking out over the yard. Clara sat and waited and told herself not to look nervous, which mostly meant sitting very still and keeping her hands flat on her knees. Garrett Mercer came in 5 minutes later. She had seen him before, the way you see anyone in a small settlement, at a distance, across a street, at the far end of a gathering. She had not paid particular attention. He was tall. That was the first thing. Broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had done actual work before they could afford to pay others to do it. His face was plain in a way that had something to it. Not handsome exactly, but solid, the kind of face that looked like it had been weather-tested and held up. He was maybe 35. He looked tired around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with last night's sleep. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said. He didn't sit immediately. He looked at her like he was trying to place her. Mr. Mercer, she said. I'm here about the cooking position. I know why you're here. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, leaning his forearms on the table. I've heard of your work. Elias Bedell says your bread's the best in the county. May Briggs says your pies are better than her own, and she's not a woman who gives compliments. May's generous. May's honest, he corrected. There's a difference. He studied her for a moment. The work would be significant. 7 days straight. The feast is for 200 guests. Full dinner service, multiple courses, a 3-tier cake. You'd have use of the full kitchen and whatever staff I can spare, though that amounts to Rosalie and 2 girls who help with basic prep. I understand. There's a condition, he said. His tone didn't change. It was flat, straightforward, the way a man delivers information he finds slightly distasteful but is committed to anyway. My fiancée, Miss Whitmore, has specific expectations about how the household presents itself during the wedding week. She would prefer that the cooking arrangements remain private. What that means in practice, Clara already understood where this was going. She kept her face still. Is that you'd use the back entrance. Stay out of the main rooms during events. If guests are present, you'd need to manage your timing so you're not visible. He paused. I apologize for the particulars. It's not my preference. But it's your condition, Clara said. It's the condition, he said. Yes, she sat with it for a moment. The smart thing, the dignified thing, would have been to stand up and thank him for his time and ride home on her horse with its bad knee and patch the roof some other way. She thought about $31, except now it wasn't $31. It was the number she'd copied onto her wrist, and it was 3 times her best month. I'll need full access to the kitchen from 5 in the morning, she said. I'll need my quantities approved in advance. No substitutions after I've planned the menu. And I need it in writing. Mercer blinked. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. Done, he said. And then something shifted in his expression, brief and hard to name. You're not going to argue about the other part? I'm not happy about the other part, she said plainly, but I need the work. Those are different things. He nodded slowly. I can respect that distinction. Will you put the payment terms in the letter as well? I will. She stood. He stood, automatically, the way men of a certain upbringing did. She offered her hand and he shook it, a businesslike shake, firm and brief. I'll start Monday, she said. She had 5 days to prepare. In the world Clara lived in, the world of actual kitchens, actual ingredients, actual heat, and timing and the thousand small variables that could unmake a meal between conception and plate, 5 days was not very much time to prepare for feeding 200 people. She sat at her kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil stub, and she built the menu the way she built anything, from the ground up, starting with what she knew cold and working outward toward the edges of her ability. The roast beef, she knew. The bread, absolutely. Pies, apple and dried cherry, 6 of each. Yes. The side dishes were manageable. The soup required attention but no extraordinary skill. The cake was the problem. She had made wedding cakes before, small ones, 2 tiers, for neighbors who couldn't afford the bakery in the nearest real town. She had never made a 3-tier cake of the scale that a Mercer wedding would demand. Not one meant to stand at the center of a table for 200 guests, to be admired before it was cut, to announce something about the people being married. She drew it out, erased it, drew it again. The base tier needed to be structurally sound enough to hold the weight of the upper 2 layers without buckling. That meant getting the internal doweling right, which she had only read about, never done. The frosting would need to be worked in stages, chilled between coats, which meant planning around the kitchen's icebox capacity. The decorative work on the surface, she decided on a prairie flower pattern, small and precise, would be the last thing she touched before the feast began, which meant she couldn't afford any delays on the lower tiers. She wrote down the timing, she wrote down the margins for error. She crossed out the margins and rewrote them smaller because she didn't have the luxury of generous margins. Then she went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours thinking about structural doweling. Monday morning, 4:45 a.m. Clara was on the road while the sky was still that particular darkness that came just before the gray started bleeding in from the east. The old horse moved carefully. She could feel him favoring the bad knee on the hard ground, and she made herself take the slower route, the one that added 20 minutes but kept him on softer soil. She arrived at Mercer Ranch in the dark and went around to the back as agreed. The kitchen was enormous. She stood in the doorway for a moment and just breathed it in. The smell of a kitchen that had been heating since someone banked the coals the night before. The size of the work surfaces. A proper iron stove, big enough to run 6 pots simultaneously. A cold room off to the left with real ice. Shelving that went to the ceiling. If I had a kitchen like that, she'd thought, years ago. She set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She had been going for 2 hours when Rosalie appeared. The housekeeper stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee and an expression that suggested she had expected to find Clara in a state of disorganized confusion and was mildly annoyed to find otherwise. "You don't need help with the bread?" Rosalie asked. "I've got it measured already. If you can manage the fire in the second oven in about 40 minutes, that would help." Rosalie looked at these organized rows of measured ingredients, at the dough already resting under a cloth, at the list on the board that had been written out in Clara's careful, small handwriting. She said, which was about as warm as Rosalie got. But Clara had spent 3 years reading what people meant versus what they said, and she understood this particular HM to mean, "All right then, you know what you're doing." "Coffee?" Rosalie offered. "Please," Clara said. "Black." He came in before sunrise on the second morning. Clara heard the door. Not the back entrance, but the interior door that connected the kitchen to the main house, and looked up from the dough she was working. Garrett Mercer was standing in the doorway in work clothes, not dressed-up clothes, holding an empty cup and looking mildly embarrassed to be there. "Didn't realize you'd already be—" he started. "I've been here since 5, she said. "There's coffee on the stove." He hesitated, like he was trying to work out whether this was his kitchen or hers, which Clara supposed was a fair question. "I don't want to be in the way," he said. "You're not in the way if you stand over there," she said, and nodded to the far side of the room where a stool sat against the wall. "Just don't cross to this side while I've got bread going, or the draft will kill the rise." He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the far side of the room and poured himself coffee and sat down on the stool. Clara went back to the dough. For a while, neither of them said anything. She was aware of him in the room. It would have been strange not to be. But the dough needed attention, and she gave it that. The bread had to be worked until it reached the right resistance, the right texture, the thing she'd learned to recognize through her palms more than her eyes. "You always start this early?" he asked, eventually. "If I want it done right." What happens if you don't start this early? She looked up briefly. The bread gets done, but it's not as good. Bread rushed tastes rushed. People say they can't tell the difference, but they can. They just can't say why. He considered this. You think about it a lot. The food. It's my work. Most people I know treat cooking as something that gets done. You talk about it like it matters. Doesn't most work matter if you're the one doing it? He was quiet for a moment. You'd think so, he said. It came out a little heavier than he probably meant it to. She didn't press. That wasn't her business. She put the dough to rest and wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the cold room to check on the stock she had put up the night before. The feast menu, he said when she came back. How's it coming? On track. The roast beef I'll start Thursday. It needs 2 days minimum. The bread is already in rotation. Pies will go in Friday. The cake... She paused. The cake? The cake is going to be fine, she said, which was only half true. The cake was going to be a significant test of everything she had taught herself, and she was not entirely certain the result wouldn't have her awake at 3 a.m. on Thursday night, making emergency adjustments. You don't sound certain, he said. She looked at him directly. Most people, when she spoke plainly about a problem, got uncomfortable. They wanted reassurance. They wanted, it'll be fine, don't worry. He was watching her with an expression that looked like actual interest. I've never made a 3-tier cake at this scale, she said. I've done smaller versions. I know the technique, but knowing a technique and executing it under this kind of time pressure with this many other things going simultaneously, she shrugged. There's a margin of risk. Is there anything I can do? She almost laughed. Not unkindly. Do you bake? My contributions in the kitchen are largely limited to boiling things I probably shouldn't be boiling. Then the most useful thing you can do, she said, is stay on that side of the room and not let anyone bother me. He smiled at that, a quick small thing that rearranged his face briefly into something warmer. I can manage that. Good, she said, and went back to work. He finished his coffee and left. He was back the next morning. On the third day, Eleanor Whitmore arrived. Clara knew she was coming. Rosalie had mentioned it in the dry information delivery tone she used for all practical updates. But nothing about the mention had prepared Clara for Eleanor Whitmore in the actual flesh. She heard her before she saw her. Voices in the main hall, one of them bright and carrying, the kind of voice trained for rooms with high ceilings. Then footsteps, and then the door to the kitchen opened, and Eleanor Whitmore stood in the frame. She was beautiful. That was the first thing, and it was worth acknowledging plainly. She was genuinely, structurally beautiful in the way of women who had grown up being beautiful and knew exactly how it worked. Dark hair, porcelain complexion, a traveling dress that had no business being that well-preserved after a journey on the frontier road. She looked at the kitchen the way certain people look at rooms they consider below them. A quick sweep, taking inventory of everything that wasn't up to standard. Her eyes landed on Clara. You must be the cook, she said. Clara Hawthorne, Clara said. She did not stop what she was doing, which was checking the temperature of the stock. Eleanor drifted into the kitchen, not entering exactly, but occupying its edges, touching things lightly and setting them back down. It smells all right in here. Thank you, Clara said. I have some thoughts about the menu, Eleanor said. Garrett showed me the plan, and I think we ought to add a French course, a proper bisque, something elevated. The guests coming from the east will expect it. Clara set down her ladle. The menu was approved last week, she said. I've already purchased quantities and planned the timing around what was agreed. Eleanor looked at her with the faint, patient expression of someone explaining something to a slow child. I'm sure you can adjust. Adjusting the menu at this stage would compromise the other dishes. I'd need to reprice and potentially delay prep on the roast beef. Well? Eleanor smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. Let's see what Garrett says. That's fine, Clara said. He approved the original plan. Eleanor's smile thinned slightly. She looked around the kitchen again, with more attention now. Her gaze stopped on Clara's apron. The faded one, the one with the small flowers embroidered along the hem, fabric so worn you could almost see through it in places. Interesting apron, Eleanor said. Clara waited. It's very... Eleanor appeared to be choosing her word with care. Rustic. It was my mother's. Ah, a beat. Well, I suppose sentiment has its place. She turned toward the door. I'll speak with Garrett about the bisque. That's your right, Clara said. Eleanor paused at the door, half turned. Something in Clara's tone, not defiant, not warm, just even, just present, seemed to catch her slightly off guard. She looked at Clara for a moment with an expression that was harder to read. Then she left. Clara stood in the kitchen for exactly 3 seconds after the door closed. Then she picked up her ladle and went back to the stock. Rosalie appeared from the cold room, where she had been working and apparently listening. Menu's not changing, Rosalie said. Menu's not changing, Clara agreed. The rest of the week built like weather. Clara worked. That was the shape of it, mostly. The endless granular labor of preparing a feast of this scale. There were mornings when she was not sure the roast beef was coming up correctly, and she stood over the low fire at 3 in the afternoon, tasting and adjusting and tasting again until she got it right. There were afternoons when the pies came out of the oven not exactly as she'd planned, and she had to make peace with good enough being the result, because she did not have time to start again. The cake was its own ongoing negotiation. She built the base tier first, late on the 4th day, when the kitchen had finally quieted enough for her to give it the concentration it required. She had practiced the doweling system twice on scrapboards, working out the distances and the load-bearing math until she felt something close to confident, which was not the same as actually confident, but would have to do. The bake itself went cleanly. She stood at the oven and watched through the small window and kept her breathing slow. When it came out, risen correctly, firm at the edges, the right golden color, she allowed herself exactly 1 moment of relief before moving immediately to cooling and planning for the second tier. Rosalie came in during the second evening and found Clara sitting on the floor beside the cold room door, eyes closed, flour in her hair, hands wrapped around the last cup of cold coffee from that morning. "When did you last eat?" Rosalie asked. Clara thought about it. "Bread at noon. That was 7 hours ago." "I know. You're not useful to anyone if you fall over." Clara opened her eyes. "Is there anything in the pot?" Rosalie produced a bowl of stew from somewhere, Clara didn't ask where, and stood at the work surface while Clara ate it sitting on the floor because she didn't have the energy to move to a chair. It was good stew. She said so. "Don't make a big thing of it," Rosalie said, and went back to what she was doing. Garrett stopped by the kitchen on the 5th morning and found Clara staring at a piece of paper on the work surface with the expression of someone doing battle with arithmetic. "Problem?" he asked. "Math," she said. "The second tier of the cake is slightly wider than I planned for. It'll still work, but I have to recalculate the frosting quantities." He came around to look at the paper, which was covered in numbers and small diagrams and one word circled hard. "Enough? Is it going to be all right?" he asked. "Yes." She said it without looking up. Then, "Probably." That's less reassuring. "I know." She paused in her calculations. "Mr. Mercer, has Miss Whitmore spoken to you about changing the menu?" She mentioned a bisque. He said it flatly. "I told her the menu was set." Clara looked up at that. He met her eyes steadily. "Thank you," she said. "You said it couldn't be changed without compromising the rest." A shrug. "I believed you. It was a small thing, probably." Clara was aware that being believed when she said something she knew to be true should not feel as significant as it did. But she had spent 3 years working in people's homes and kitchens and spaces, and being believed when she said something professional was not as common as it should have been. "The cake's going to be all right," she said, and this time she meant it fully. He smiled at that, the small, quick one again. "You sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "Now please get off my side of the kitchen." He went. She went back to the math, but something in her chest was lighter, which she filed away under not relevant right now and moved on. The night before the wedding, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the small room that Rosalie had arranged for her at the edge of the staff quarters, a practical kindness given that she needed to be in the kitchen by 4:30, and looked at the ceiling and went through the checklist in her head for the 9th time. Roast beef. Resting correctly in the cold room would go back to low heat at 6 a.m. Bread. First batch is ready to bake at 6:30. Pies. Cooling on the shelves, covered. Side dishes, prepped, staged, ready for the final hour. Soup, base done, finishing touches tomorrow. Cake, all 3 tiers assembled, doweled, frosted twice, the final decorative coat to go on in the early morning. Everything was where it should be. She knew this. She had checked. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore, about the way Eleanor had touched the apron with her eyes and said rustic the way people say inferior, about the small flower pattern that her mother had embroidered, petal by petal, with the reading glasses she hated wearing and the patience that had been one of her most defining qualities. Clara's mother had been a cook, not professionally, just within the borders of their home, which had not been large or wealthy. But she had cooked with intention, the way some people pray, the way some people build things. Every meal she made was considered. Every meal said something about who she was and what she believed the people at her table deserved. Claire had learned everything she knew at that table. She looked at the dark ceiling. Tomorrow, she would feed 200 people she was not allowed to be seen by. They would eat her food and not know her name. She had agreed to this. It was the arrangement she'd made, and arrangements had to be honored. She told herself it didn't matter, that what she made was more important than whether people knew she'd made it. She wasn't entirely sure she believed that, but she got up at 4:15 anyway, because there was bread to bake. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a Wyoming sky that had no patience for drama. Flat blue from horizon to horizon, cold enough to see your breath, the kind of clear that made every edge sharp. Clara was in the kitchen before the sun. She moved the way she moved when she was absolutely focused. Not quickly, but without hesitation, each task moving into the next the way links in a chain connect. Bread into the ovens, beef back to low heat, soup to simmer. The cold room organized for the final service. And then, when everything else was staged and the kitchen girls had arrived and been given their positions, she turned to the cake. The final coat of frosting needed to go on cleanly. She worked in silence. The cake stood on the cooling shelf where she'd built it. All 3 tiers, properly doweled, the previous coat smooth and set. She mixed the final frosting to the right consistency, which had required 2 adjustments this morning because the cold air changed the behavior of the butter, and she stood in front of the cake and breathed out slowly. Then she began. The decorative coat went on from bottom to top, a clean sweep at each pass, the spatula angle consistent. She had practiced this movement hundreds of times on the sides of bowls and test boards and the air in front of her, and her hands knew what they were supposed to do even when she was too tired to think about it consciously. The surface came up smooth, smoother than she'd hoped, actually. The cold had helped, she realized. It was setting quickly and cleanly. The prairie flowers were last. She had made the small sugar decorations the day before, delicate, slightly imperfect, which was intentional, because perfect-looking things at a scale this small looked artificial, and she was not interested in artificial. She placed each flower where she had planned, working from her drawing, giving each one a slightly different angle, so the overall pattern had rhythm rather than rigidity. Rosalie came and stood beside her when she placed the last one. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's something," Rosalie said finally. "It is," Clara agreed. She stepped back and looked at the whole of it. 3 tiers, white as the sky outside was blue, the flowers catching the morning light. It was good. It was genuinely, honestly good. She wiped her hands on the apron and turned back to the stove. There was still a feast to finish. The first guests arrived at noon. Clara heard the sounds of arrival filtering through from the main hall. Voices, laughter, the stamp of boots on the porch. And she worked with her back to the kitchen doors and kept her mind on the timing. The service would start at 1. She had 45 minutes. The kitchen was heat and noise and the smell of everything she'd made over 7 days coming together in one concentrated hour. The bread was out and cooling, the beef had been resting and was at the right temperature. The soup was ready. The pies were perfect. She checked them once more, resisting the urge to adjust anything because adjusting at this stage would only make things worse. "Ready?" she asked the kitchen girls. "Ready," said one of them, a girl named Pia, who had started nervous and gotten considerably less so over the week. "Then let's go," Clara said, and the feast began. None. She did not watch it happen. That was the arrangement. The food went out through the service door, carried by the household staff, and Clara stayed in the kitchen and managed the flow and the timing and the endless small corrections that kept a feast of this scale from collapsing into chaos. But she heard it. She heard the room go quiet at certain moments, the way rooms go quiet when something remarkable arrives at the table. She heard the sound of 200 people eating and talking and occasionally exclaiming. She heard a word drift back through the service door more than once. Extraordinary. She kept moving. There was always something that needed doing. The cake went out last, carried by Rosalie and Pia on a wide board, and Clara stood at the door of the kitchen and watched it cross the threshold and disappear into the hall. From inside, after a moment, there was an audible response. Clara let herself feel it, just for that second. Just the sound of 200 people reacting to something she had made. Then she turned back to the kitchen and started dealing with the mess. She did not see what happened next in the hall. She did not see Eleanor Whitmore set down her champagne glass and stand up, but she heard it. Through the door, muffled but clear enough, Eleanor's voice carrying above the crowd with the ease of someone who had been trained to perform. "Thank you all so much. I am truly overwhelmed by your kind words about the food. The preparation has been entirely my own. I have always believed that a celebration of this kind deserves a personal touch." A murmur of appreciation from the crowd. Clara stood very still with a dishcloth in her hands. "I have always believed that a celebration of this kind deserves a personal touch." Something happened in her chest that she didn't have an exact name for. It wasn't only anger, though anger was certainly present. It was more specific than that. The particular feeling of having worked the hardest week of your recent life, of having pushed yourself past the edge of exhaustion, of having made something genuinely good, and then watching that thing be picked up by someone else's hands and claimed in front of 200 witnesses. She stood there for 3 full seconds. Then Eleanor's voice came through the door again, lighter now, laughing, warming to the attention, the way certain people warm to light. "The poor woman we hired to assist with some of the basic kitchen work, the widow, you know, the one from the crossing, she managed the simpler things. But the vision, the planning, all the real work." Clara set down the dishcloth. She put both hands flat on the work surface and looked at the kitchen, her kitchen, for this week, and breathed. Through the door, Eleanor Whitmore was still talking, describing the cake, taking credit for the design, and the crowd was listening because Eleanor was beautiful and confident, and this was, after all, her wedding. Clara picked up the dishcloth again. She folded it neatly and set it on the shelf. She untied her apron and laid it on the hook where it belonged. She was about to reach for her coat when the door from the main hall opened, and Garrett Mercer walked into the kitchen, and his face told her everything she needed to know about what had just happened on the other side of the door. "She's telling them she made it," Clara said. Not a question. "She's telling them she made it," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled in the way that suggested the control was being applied deliberately. "And she's telling them about the widow from the crossing. I heard some of it." "How much?" "Enough." He looked at her across the kitchen. The fire in the stove had died down, and the room smelled of everything she'd made, bread and beef and sugar, and the faint wood smoke that had worked itself into every surface over the week. "I'm sorry," he said. "This isn't what I—" He stopped, started again. "This isn't what I thought she was." "People show you what they want you to see," Clara said. It came out even, not bitter, though she felt things more complicated than even underneath. "She's in there right now." He ran a hand over the back of his neck. "In front of 200 people, taking credit for—" He gestured at the kitchen, at everything in it. "I know." "And you're going to walk out the back." She picked up her coat. That was the arrangement. "Clara." His voice changed. Not forceful, but direct. The way he'd been direct with her since that first morning. "That was an arrangement made before I understood what she was doing. What she did has nothing to do with our arrangement. It has everything to do with Mr. Mercer." She stopped him, quiet but firm. "What happens in that hall is your business, your guests, your wedding. My part is done." She put her coat on. "I need you to understand I'm not leaving because I'm ashamed. I'm not leaving because she won. I'm leaving because I am very tired and I have done my job and I don't need to be in that room for any of this." He looked at her for a long moment. "I won't let it stand," he said. "That's your decision," she said. "Not mine." She picked up her bag. She walked to the back door, the door she had used every morning of this week, the door she had agreed to. and she pushed it open. The night air was cold and clear, the sky enormous over the prairie. She stepped through and walked toward the road. Behind her, after a moment, she heard the sound of the door from the kitchen to the main hall open and close. And then, dimly, she heard Garrett Mercer's voice rise above the crowd. She didn't stop walking, but she slowed, just slightly, and the night was quiet enough that she heard him begin to speak, clear, even, the voice of a man who had something to say and was going to say it. And behind her, as she walked out into the enormous Wyoming night with her mother's apron in her bag and the cold stars overhead, she heard the room go very, very quiet. She was maybe 200 yards down the road when she heard it. Not words. The distance was too great for words. But the sound of a room changing, the low murmur of 200 people at a feast, and then something cutting through it, and then a silence that was different in quality from the comfortable silence of people eating. This was the silence of people listening to something they hadn't expected to hear. Clara kept walking. The horse was tied at the post near the side gate where she'd left him, and she moved toward him in the dark, her boots finding the uneven ground by feel. The cold had settled in properly now, the kind that got into the collar of your coat and stayed there, and her breath came out in small, visible clouds that dissolved almost immediately in the still air. She untied the reins, patted the old horse once on the neck, feeling the warmth of him against her cold palm. Behind her, from the lit windows of the ranch house, she heard a sound rise and break off. She put her foot in the stirrup. Then she stopped. The sound from the hall had changed again. It was louder now, not the comfortable noise of celebration, but something more fractured, the acoustic signature of a room where something had gone wrong and nobody was quite sure yet what to do about it. Voices layering over each other. A woman's voice, higher than the rest, with an edge that carried even at this distance. Eleanor. Clara stood with one hand on the saddle and one foot on the ground and told herself to get on the horse and go home. She told herself this twice. Then she turned around, looped the reins back over the post, and walked back toward the ranch house. She did not go in through the front door. That was not something she was ready for, and she knew the difference between a principled decision and a foolish one. She went around to the kitchen entrance, her entrance, this week's entrance, and pushed it open quietly, and stood in the warm kitchen that smelled of everything she'd made, and listened. She could hear Garrett's voice. Not the words yet, but the cadence. Measured, deliberate, the way he talked when he was being careful about something. And she could hear Eleanor's voice cutting across it in a register she recognized, not angry exactly, but threatened, which sometimes produced the same sounds. Clara moved to the service door. It was cracked an inch, the way it had been left after the last tray went out. She put her back against the wall beside it and listened. "Don't understand why you're doing this," Eleanor was saying, "in front of everyone, on our wedding day. You're going to humiliate me in front of every important person in this territory because of a hired cook?" "I'm telling them the truth," Garrett said. "That's not the same as humiliating you." "It is exactly the same thing, and you know it." Her voice dropped, lower and more dangerous. "Garrett, think about what you're doing." "I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday, actually, when Rosalie told me what you said to her in the hallway, and Thursday, when Pia came to me because she didn't know what else to do." A pause. Long enough to be uncomfortable. "Whatever they told you, I'm not talking about what they told me. I'm talking about what I've seen." His voice stayed even, which somehow made it more significant than if he'd raised it. "Eleanor, you walked into this ranch and treated every person who works here as though they were furniture, staff who've been with my family for 15 years. You said things, I know what you said, I'm not going to pretend I don't. And I kept thinking it would pass, that it was nerves, or the journey, or adjustment. And now you've decided it isn't. Now I know it isn't." Another silence. Clara was aware of her own breathing. She made it quiet. "This is about that woman," Eleanor said. The way she said it, that woman, had a specific texture, something dismissive ground into it at the level of instinct. "You've spent the week talking to the kitchen help, and now you've decided you know something about my character. I've decided I know something about your character because I watched you stand up in front of 200 people and claim credit for work you never touched, and then describe the woman who did it as uneducated. I said no such. I was in the room, Eleanor." The silence this time had a different quality, harder. "She's a widow who makes bread," Eleanor said, and her voice had gone cold in a way that was worse than the anger. She was paid to do a job. That's the end of it. That's all it is. That's where you and I see things differently, Garrett said. Clara heard movement, the sound of someone crossing the floor, and then Eleanor's voice again, closer to the door now. If you do this, Eleanor said, quieter now, nearly intimate, there's no coming back from it. You understand that. Everyone in that room will remember it. I know. Your reputation is going to survive being honest, he said. I'm less sure it would survive the alternative. Clara heard the exact moment Eleanor understood he meant it. It came through the door as a sound she couldn't quite categorize. Not a word, barely even a breath, just a short, hard exhale of something that might have been disbelief. Then Eleanor said, in a voice that had gone entirely flat, "You're going to regret this." "Maybe," Garrett said, "but not tonight." Clara took 3 quiet steps back from the door. She stood in the kitchen with her coat still on and her bag in her hand and something happening in her chest that she couldn't neatly identify, except that it was big and complicated and she was not going to stand here in the kitchen at this hour and try to sort it out. She heard Garrett's voice rise again from the other side of the door, addressing the room now, not Eleanor. And she heard the crowd settle into listening, and she put her hand on the back door latch. She heard him say her name. Clara Hawthorne. 2 words, carrying clearly through the door and the wall and the whole lit-up ranch house and out into the Wyoming night. Her hand stayed on the latch. She heard him describe the week. Not dramatically, he wasn't that kind of man, but specifically, which was worse. Specific things are harder to dismiss than sweeping ones. He said she had arrived before sunrise every morning. He said the bread alone had taken 3 days to develop properly. He said the cake had been designed and built from nothing by a woman who had never made one at that scale because she was skilled enough to figure out what she'd never done before. He said she had been asked to stay invisible, and she had honored that, even when it cost her. He said the feast they had just eaten, every piece of it, had been the work of her hands. The room was very quiet. Then someone started clapping, and the applause spread the way real applause spreads. Unevenly, people coming to it at different speeds, but building until the room was full of it. Clara pushed the door open and walked out into the cold. She untied the horse for the second time, mounted carefully, mindful of his knee, turned toward the road. She rode about a mile before she heard hoofbeats behind her. She didn't stop. She kept riding, and the hoofbeats got closer, and she thought, of course, and don't. And you're tired, Clara. Just keep going, all at approximately the same time. Mrs. Hawthorne. She pulled up. Garrett Mercer came alongside her on a horse that was considerably less old and limping than hers. He was still in his wedding clothes, which seemed impractical for a nighttime ride, but was not, she decided, her business to comment on. They were on the open road, no lights anywhere, the sky above them enormous and scattered with cold stars. Their horse's breath made small clouds in the dark. "You heard," he said. "Some of it." "Then you know what happened." "I know what you said," she told him. "I don't know what's going to happen next, and I'd guess you don't either." He looked at her steadily. Even in the dark, she could see that the tired look around his eyes that had been there all week was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Not happier exactly, but more honest. Like a man who had set down something heavy and was only now assessing how long he'd been carrying it. "She left," he said. "Eleanor. She packed what she'd brought and she left." Clara said nothing. I don't want you to think this is about you." He stopped. Started again, with more care. "That's not right. What I mean is, what happened tonight would have happened. Maybe not tonight, but it would have happened because I've been pretending for months that things I saw weren't what they were. Tonight just..." He paused. "Tonight made it impossible to keep pretending." "Because she took credit for my food?" Clara asked. She wasn't being cold about it. She genuinely wanted to understand the mechanics. "Because of how she talked about you," he said. "She said uneducated, in front of a room full of people who knew you, who'd bought your bread, who'd seen you work." He was quiet for a moment, and I sat there for a count of maybe 5 seconds, thinking about whether to say anything, and I realized I'd been doing that for months, counting to 5, deciding it wasn't my place, or wasn't the moment, or that it would smooth over. And tonight it didn't smooth over. Tonight I stopped counting. The horses shifted. Clara's old horse nickered softly, and she reached down and patted his neck without thinking. "I'm sorry," Garrett said. "For the arrangement, the back entrance, all of it." "You were honest about the terms," she said. "I accepted them." "That doesn't mean I was right to offer them." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But I'm a grown woman who made a choice with clear information. I don't need you to take that away from me by deciding you're more sorry about it than I am." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Surprised, then something warmer. "That's fair?" he said. "I know it is." A silence settled between them, but it was a different kind of silence than awkwardness. It was the silence of two people who had spent a week in the same building, finding that they could be quiet together outdoors as well. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Home." "It's cold. The road's rough past the second mile." "I know the road," she said. "I know you do." A beat. He stopped again. The stopping and starting, she realized, was not because he was confused. It was because he was being careful, choosing actual words rather than convenient ones. "I wanted to say something to you before you got too far. That's all." "All right," she said. "Say it." He looked out over the dark prairie for a moment. "You made something this week that people are going to talk about for a long time. Not because it was extraordinary, though it was, but because you made it under conditions that would have stopped most people, and you made it without once making it anyone else's problem but your own." He paused. "I don't know many people like that." Clara sat with that for a moment. "My mother would have said that's just what work looks like," she said finally. "Your mother sounds like she was right about a lot of things." "She was right about most things." A pause. "She was wrong about the biscuit recipe, but I've never told anyone that." Garrett laughed. An actual laugh, short and genuine, and it changed his face completely. She noticed this the way she noticed temperatures in an oven, practically, with the understanding that it mattered. "Go back to your guests," Clara said. "You've got 200 people in your hall and an evening that went sideways, and they're going to need someone to—" "Rosalie has it," he said. "Rosalie always has it. She'd be offended if I suggested otherwise." That was true. Clara had learned this about Rosalie very quickly. "Still," she said. "Still," he agreed. He didn't move, though. Neither did she, for a moment. And the dark road stretched out in both directions, and the stars were very bright, and her horse's bad knee was probably going to ache tomorrow from this midnight excursion. "Clara," he said. First name, which he hadn't used before. She noticed the small shift of it. "Mr. Mercer?" "Garrett," he said. "Under the circumstances, I think that's—" "Garrett," she said. He nodded. "I'd like to call on you, if you'd be willing." She looked at him, measured him the way she measured things that required precision. Honestly, without wishful thinking, without letting herself round up when the number was lower than she wanted. He was a man who had just ended his engagement on his wedding night. He was tired and, probably, under the steadiness, in some degree of shock about what the evening had turned into. He was looking at her on a dark road and asking something that deserved a real answer, not a polite one. "I'm not going to be a remedy," she said, "for whatever tonight was. For Eleanor, or for a decision that went wrong. I'm not that. I'm not asking you to be. You might not know what you're asking right now." "That's fair," he said. "That's completely fair. But I'm asking anyway." She looked at the road ahead, at the dark shape of the prairie and the far-off suggestion of hills and the sky that went on forever in every direction. "Give me a month," she said. "Come to the crossing in a month. If you still want to call on me then, I'll consider it." "A month," he said. "You might feel differently in a month." "I might," he said, "but I don't think so." "Then a month is a short wait," she said, and she touched her heel to the horse's flank, gentle on account of the bad knee, and started down the road. She heard him sit there for a moment before he turned back toward the ranch. She didn't look. But she heard the shift of his horse's hooves on the frozen ground, and she listened to the sound of it fade as she moved further into the dark. The cold was proper now, settling through her coat, and her hands on the reins were going numb at the fingers. The road home was 4 miles, and her horse would take it carefully, and she would be back before midnight if nothing went wrong. And tomorrow she would sleep until 7, and then get up and tend the stove and start the week's bread because the larder merchant had asked for 24 loaves by Thursday. Her name had been spoken in front of 200 people tonight. She thought about that, riding alone in the dark. turned it over the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. It didn't feel the way she'd expected it to feel, if she was honest. She'd half thought that being acknowledged publicly would be some tremendous release. All the weeks and months of invisible work finally seen, finally counted, and there would be a sense of something being set right. What she actually felt was quieter than that, less triumphant. She felt something more like, yes, that is what happened. That is the truth of it, and now it's been said out loud. And strangely, plainly, that was enough. She was nearly a mile from home, in the deepest part of the dark between settlements, when something loosened in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Not tears. She still wasn't a crier, hadn't been since the graveside 3 years ago, but a long, slow exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. She had made the best meal of her life this week. She had made it in conditions she'd found humiliating and that she'd accepted anyway, which she wasn't entirely proud of, but she understood the mathematics of survival well enough to know that pride and rent were not the same currency. She had made something real, and it had been real regardless of whether Eleanor Whitmore claimed it. The roast beef had tasted the way it tasted. The bread had been what it was. The cake, her cake, had stood 3 tiers high in the light of that hall, and 200 people had looked at it and known that something remarkable had happened even before they knew who to credit. You couldn't take that back. The horse plodded on. His breath came steady in the cold air. She could feel the slight hitch of the bad knee in his gait, rhythmic and familiar. Almost home, she told him. He didn't respond because he was a horse, and she was tired enough that she was talking to horses, which was a sign that she needed to sleep. She thought about Garrett Mercer on the dark road with his wedding clothes and his worn-around-the-eyes expression that had tonight changed into something less like exhaustion and more like a man coming out the other side of a long confusion. A month, she had said. It was a reasonable condition. She believed in reasonable conditions. She believed in not rushing at things simply because they were being offered, and she believed in not refusing things simply because they were unexpected. Both were forms of fear, she'd decided, and she'd spent enough of the last 3 years making decisions out of fear. What she was not was certain, but uncertain and hopeful were not incompatible, she'd found. The lights of her small house appeared in the distance, the lamp she'd left burning in the window because she had come to believe, in the years alone, that coming home to a dark house was a small cruelty she didn't need to inflict on herself. She brought the horse around to the small shelter at the side of the house and got him settled. Feed, water, a check on the bad knee that seemed no worse for the evening's use, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table in her coat for a long moment. The stove needed banking for the night. She'd do that in a minute. The week's worth of exhaustion was sitting on her now, the way real fatigue sits. Not dramatic, just heavy, like wearing an extra layer of everything. Her hands ached, her feet ached. The back of her neck, where she'd been holding tension she hadn't fully acknowledged, ached. She put her bag on the table and took out the apron, unfolded it, laid it flat on the wood in the lamplight. The small embroidered flowers ran along the hem. Her mother's careful, patient work, color faded now to something softer than it had originally been, which she'd always thought made it prettier rather than worse. Eleanor Whitmore had looked at this apron and said rustic. Clara looked at it now in the lamplight and thought, no, not rustic. Careful, she thought, patient, real. She folded it again and set it on the shelf where she kept it, and then she got up and banked the stove for the night and blew out the lamp and went to bed. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Outside, the Wyoming night went on, enormous and indifferent, and the stars overhead were the same stars they'd always been. And somewhere across 4 miles of frozen prairie, the lights of Mercer Ranch were still lit, and 200 people were finding their way through the end of an evening that had turned out to be nothing like what any of them had expected. But in the small house at the edge of Red Creek Crossing, Clara Hawthorne slept without dreaming, and the apron sat folded on its shelf, and the stove kept the room warm enough, and that was, for that night, everything that needed to be true. The Thursday bread went out on time. 24 loaves for the larder merchant, same as agreed, and Clara carried them herself in the flat-bottomed cart, because the horse's knee needed rest, and she was not, despite everything, above walking 4 miles with bread, if that was what the morning required. The merchant, a heavy-set man named Connell, who had never once paid her a compliment directly, but had been ordering from her every week for 2 years, which she understood as the more reliable form of approval, took the loaves without comment and counted out the correct payment and then said, almost as an afterthought, without looking up from his ledger, "Heard about the Mercer wedding?" "Did you?" Clara said. "Word travels." He set his pencil down, looked at her for a moment with the measuring expression she'd seen on him before, the one that meant he was making a calculation of some kind. "Heard it was quite a feast." "The guests seemed to think so." "Heard some other things, too." He picked his pencil back up. "About the credit for it." Clara waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had practice. "Anyway," Connell said. He made a mark in the ledger. "I'm putting in for 3 dozen next week. If you can manage it." "I can manage it," she said. That was Monday. By Wednesday, she had 2 more orders she hadn't had before, both from people who had been at the Mercer wedding, which she understood but did not dwell on too much, because dwelling on things that had already happened was not, in her experience, a productive use of attention. The week after that, a woman named Helen Pratt came to her door and asked if she would consider taking on a standing contract for the Pratt household. Meals twice a week, bread as needed. Helen Pratt was the wife of the county judge, and she had the kind of careful social presence that suggested she was always doing 3 calculations simultaneously. She stood at Clara's door in a good coat and said very directly, "I was at the Mercer dinner. I want the person who made that food cooking for my family." "I'm not a household cook," Clara said. "I do baking and prepared meals, but I work out of my own kitchen." "That's fine," Helen said. "I'll send someone to collect." They agreed on terms. Clara went back inside and stood in her kitchen for a moment and looked at the numbers she'd have at the end of the month if the orders kept up, and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. The roof was going to be fine. She didn't let herself think about it much beyond that. Rosalie came out to the crossing on a Friday, 10 days after the wedding, riding a good steady mare, and arriving at Clara's door with the expression of someone who has a purpose and intends to fulfill it efficiently. "I brought something," she said. She held out a box, not large, wrapped in plain cloth, and Clara took it and opened it and found inside a new apron, heavy canvas, well made, with a double-stitched hem and proper ties. Clara looked at it, looked at Rosalie. "From the staff," Rosalie said, clipped, matter of fact, which was Rosalie's register for things she felt more about than she intended to show. Pia picked the fabric. The rest of us chipped in. "Rosalie," Clara said, "don't make something of it." "I'm just going to say thank you." "Then say it and stop looking at me like that." "Thank you," Clara said. "Tell Pia she has good taste." "I'll tell her no such thing. She's already insufferable about the cake decorations. Apparently she helped you place 2 flowers and now she's considering herself an artist." Rosalie's expression didn't change, but something in the corners of it did, very slightly. "She's a good girl." "She is," Clara agreed. Rosalie came inside and had coffee, which was the first time she'd sat in Clara's kitchen rather than the other way around, and it was strange, and not strange at the same time, the way certain adjustments are when you realize they were already underway before you named them. "How's the ranch?" Clara asked. She wasn't sure exactly what she meant by it, but Rosalie understood. "Quiet," she said. "The way it gets after something big. Mr. Mercer's been working the south pasture all week. Gets up before I'm even in the kitchen." A pause, the kind Rosalie used when she was deciding how much to say. "He's not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. He's not moping around. He's just—" Another pause. "Working through something, the way he does." "How does he do it?" Clara asked, and then felt faintly foolish for asking, which she didn't show. "Quietly," Rosalie said, "by staying busy until it settles." She drank her coffee. "Same as you, from what I can tell." Clara acknowledged this with a slight tilt of her head and didn't say anything else about it. Before Rosalie left, she stood in the doorway and said, without turning around, "He asked me how you were. 3 times in 10 days I told him you were working." "That's accurate," Clara said. "I know it is." Rosalie finally turned. "I'm not telling you what to do about anything. You're a sensible woman, and you don't need my opinion on your life. But I've worked for that family for a long time, and I know the difference between a man who acts a certain way because it's expected and a man who acts a certain way because it's who he is." She looked at Clara steadily. "He stopped counting to 5. That's not nothing." She left before Clara could figure out what to say, which was probably intentional. The month was not easy. Not because anything went wrong, exactly. The orders kept coming. The work was steady. The roof held through a week of hard rain, and the horse's knee improved enough that he could make the road to the crossing without trouble. On the surface of things, October moved along the way. October usually moved, getting colder, the days getting shorter, the quality of light changing until everything looked like it was made of copper. But Clara was aware of an undercurrent to the month that she couldn't entirely ignore. She was known now, in a way she hadn't been before. Not famous. Red Creek Crossing was not a place where anyone became famous, but visible. People greeted her on the road differently. Not dramatically differently, just they greeted her, made eye contact, stopped to say something instead of passing with a nod. The dry goods woman, who had been perfectly pleasant for 3 years without ever quite seeing Clara, began asking how the baking was going with a specific interest that suggested she'd asked someone else first and been told it was worth asking about. Clara found this simultaneously gratifying and uncomfortable, which she suspected was an honest response to it. She did not like being an object of public attention. She had in fact spent considerable energy over the past 3 years arranging her life to require as little of it as possible. She did good work. She got paid. She went home. That had been the shape of things, and it had suited her. Now people knew her name who hadn't before, and some of them knew it because of something she was proud of, and some of them knew it because of a public scene at a powerful man's wedding, and she couldn't always tell which category she was dealing with when someone stopped her on the road. That uncertainty was new, and she was still learning how to carry it. On the 3rd week of October, she had a harder day than usual, a cake order that went wrong on the 2nd attempt and had to be started from scratch, a conversation with a supplier about a price increase that she couldn't absorb without raising her own prices, and a late evening that ended with her sitting at the kitchen table with a headache and the specific exhaustion that came from too much problem-solving in too short a window. She sat with the lamp turned low and thought about Thomas. She did this sometimes, still. Not constantly, not with the weight it had carried in the first year, but occasionally, when things were hard, she thought about what it had been like to have another person in the house. Someone to say, "It's been a difficult day to," which was not the same as having someone fix the difficulty, but was, it turned out, more important than she'd understood when she'd had it. Thomas had been a quiet man, but he had been a present one. He had listened without interrupting, which was rarer than people thought. He had been, in his way, reliably there. She thought about Garrett Mercer saying, "I'd like to call on you on a dark road in wedding clothes." And she thought about Rosalie saying he stopped counting to 5. And she thought about how neither of those things necessarily added up to the same thing as having someone to say, "It's been a difficult day, too." She went to bed without resolving any of it. The next morning the headache was gone, and there was bread to make, and she got up and made it, and the day was better, and by noon she had mostly set the previous day's particular heaviness aside. That was the shape of the month, up and down. Not dramatic, just the ordinary friction of a life that was changing faster than she was entirely comfortable with. He came on a Monday morning, the 30th day. She was in the kitchen, where else, and she heard the horse on the road and looked out the window and saw Garrett Mercer coming up the path in work clothes and a good coat, and she thought, exactly 30 days. He counted. She dried her hands and opened the door before he knocked. He stood on her porch, looking like a man who had thought about this moment and was now discovering that the thinking hadn't prepared him for the actual version of it, which was, she thought, a recognizable state. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "You counted the days," she said. "I did." Not embarrassed about it, just honest. 30 days, you said. I said a month. A month is 30 days, give or take. The corner of his mouth moved. I chose not to give or take. She stood back from the door. "Come in, then." He came into her kitchen, not Rosalie's, not the enormous Mercer Ranch kitchen, but the small, warm, particular-smelling space where she had spent 3 years building a life. And he stood there with his hat in his hands and looked around with an attention that was not the assessing look of someone calculating the value of what they were seeing, but the look of someone trying to understand a place by paying attention to it. "Coffee?" she said. "Please." She put it on. They stood on opposite sides of the table in a quiet that was slightly different from the easy quiet of the ranch kitchen. This was her territory, not shared, and they were both aware of it. "How are you?" he asked. "Working," she said. "Business has picked up. I heard. Connell mentioned the bread order. Helen Pratt mentioned you at the county meeting, apparently. I got that secondhand. He paused. Are you happy about that? The increased orders? I'm happy about the income, she said carefully. The attention that came with it is more complicated. How so? She thought about how to say it without either understating or overdoing it. I don't have a lot of practice being known, she said. I know how to work. I'm good at work. Being recognized for it is different. It doesn't sit entirely comfortably yet. Does it sit at all? Some days better than others. She poured the coffee, handed him a cup. How are you? He received the question the way you receive a return of the thing you threw. He hadn't expected it quite that directly. She could tell. Better than I was, he said. I've had some conversations I should have had months ago, with myself mostly. Useful conversations? Overdue ones. He held the cup in both hands. I owe you something I'm not sure I know how to say properly. You don't owe me anything, she said. I do. He looked at her steadily. He had, she'd noticed, a way of looking at people without looking past them, which was rarer than it should have been. The arrangement I offered you, Sit, asking you to come in through the back, stay invisible. I told myself it was just practical, that it was business, and you'd agreed, and that made it acceptable. It was business, she said. I did agree. You agreed because you needed the money, and I was in a position to offer it. That's not the same as it being right. He set the cup down. I thought about it a lot this month, about the fact that I asked a skilled woman to hide herself in my house because my fiancé preferred not to acknowledge the labor it took to feed 200 people. A beat. That's not a position I want to be in again. Clara was quiet for a moment. The stove was the only sound in the kitchen, the small, consistent tick of heat against metal. I told you at the time I wasn't happy about it, she said. I told you it was the terms and I was taking the job anyway. You did. So you knew it wasn't right. He didn't look away. Yes. Then why are you telling me now? Because I want you to know that I know, not to explain it away or make it easier to hear, just... He stopped. I'm not asking you to forgive me for a business arrangement. I'm telling you that if there's going to be anything between us, any version of anything, I don't want to start it with that sitting unaddressed. Clara looked at him across her kitchen table, at this man who had ridden out here on the 30th day and was standing in her house saying the thing that needed to be said without dressing it up or asking her to make it smaller than it was. All right, she said. I hear you. That's all? What else do you want? He thought about it. Nothing, he said. I think that's what I wanted, just to be heard. She nodded, picked up her own coffee. Sit down, Garrett. He sat. She sat across from him, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the October light was doing its copper-colored thing through the window, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Tell me something, he said. What kind of something? Anything. About yourself? Something I don't know yet. She looked at him. The question was simple, and it was also not simple at all, because it was the kind of question that had a dozen ways in, and she had to decide which one to take. She could have said something safe, about the baking, about the larder contract, about the business, things that were real but lived on the surface. I didn't cry at my husband's funeral, she said instead. She wasn't sure why she said it. It was just the first true thing that came. His expression didn't change toward pity, which she'd feared. He just listened. I was doing arithmetic, she continued, standing at the graveside in the rain, counting what was left in the coffee tin. I felt guilty about that on and off for 3 years, the not crying. Do you still? She considered it genuinely, the way she did things when she wanted an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. Less, she said. I think I've started to understand that the arithmetic was its own kind of grief. There just wasn't room for both at the same time. That sounds right, he said, quietly. Not like he was filling a silence, but like he actually meant it. Thomas was a good man, she said. He deserved a wife who wept at his grave. He had a wife who kept his house and fed herself for 3 years on her own in hard country, Garrett said. I think that probably counts for something. Clara looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Something about that had landed differently than she expected. Not sentimentally. It wasn't sentimental. It was just accurate. Someone saying the accurate thing plainly without trying to make it more than it was. Your turn, she said. My turn? Something I don't know about you. He was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man doing his own assessment of available doors and their destinations. I almost didn't take the ranch, he said, when my father left it to me. I was living in Denver. I'd been there 5 years working in a land office, and I had a life there that was... He paused. Not happy exactly, but familiar, and comfortable in the way that familiar things get comfortable even when they're not quite right. What made you come back? Stubbornness, mostly. The feeling that walking away from something your family built because it was inconvenient was a kind of cowardice. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. And partly because there was someone in Denver, a woman. And I knew, when it came to the decision, that I wasn't staying for her, which told me something about what it was. Did she know you were leaving? She knew before I did, he said. She was considerably clearer-eyed about it than I was. A pause. She's married now to a man who sells insurance, and she seems, from what I hear, genuinely content, which I'm glad for. That's a generous thing to say. It's true, which makes it easier to be generous about. He looked up from the cup. I came back here and I threw myself into the ranch, and for a while I thought that would be sufficient. That work would be the shape of the life, and that would be enough. And then Eleanor, Clara said. And then Eleanor, he agreed. Who was everything that looked like the right answer to the question of what comes after work? Sophisticated, educated, from the right family, beautiful. He stopped. All the things that look like what you're supposed to want, but weren't what you wanted. Weren't what was true, he said, which was a slightly different thing, and she noticed the difference. I kept thinking it would become true if I gave it enough time. That's a very human mistake, she said. I know. A pause. What's less forgivable is that I saw things along the way that told me otherwise, and I kept counting to 5 and deciding not to say anything. You said it eventually. I said it when it became impossible not to, he said. That's not the same as courage. Clara looked at him. He was sitting in her kitchen being harder on himself than she had been on him, which she found both admirable and slightly exhausting. You're going to have to decide, she said, whether you're going to spend the rest of your life adding up what you should have done differently, or whether you're going to use what you learned and move forward. You can't do both. He looked at her. That's direct? It's what I think. Is that what you did? After Thomas? She thought about the graveside in the rain, about the arithmetic in her head and the bread that needed tending. Eventually, she said, not immediately. It took me about a year to understand that staying in the grief wasn't the same as honoring him. What was the thing that moved you forward? Work, she said. Just the work. Getting up and making something. The fact that it needed doing, and I was the person who could do it. She paused. And May Briggs's cornbread, actually, which sounds strange, but she showed up with it at the right moment, and something about someone making something for me. When I spent all my time making things for other people, she stopped, surprised herself with how far into that she'd gone. It mattered, he said. It mattered, she agreed. He nodded slowly, looked at her across the kitchen table with that way he had of looking that didn't slide past her. I'd like to come back, he said. Not next week. I'm not pushing, but again, if you'd be open to it. Clara looked at her hands on the table. Her baker's hands, rough at the knuckles, flour permanently under 2 of her nails no matter how hard she scrubbed. She thought about what Rosalie had said. He stopped counting to 5. She thought about the dark road and the cold stars, and herself not quite getting on the horse. She thought about the arithmetic she'd been doing at a graveside 3 years ago, and the fact that she was 30 years old and the October light through the window was genuinely beautiful, and she had never been particularly interested in pretending things were smaller than they were. There's a harvest supper at the Briggs farm in 2 weeks, she said. May always needs help in the kitchen. If you wanted to come and do something useful with your hands for a few hours, instead of whatever it is ranchers do on Saturday afternoons. He looked at her, understanding what she was offering. Not a formal occasion, not a public declaration, not anything that would require either of them to perform something for other people. Just 2 people being in the same place, doing the same ordinary thing, and seeing what that was like. Do you think May would mind? He asked. May Briggs hasn't met a person she couldn't put to work, Clara said. She'll hand you a peeling knife inside 30 seconds and she won't care who you are or what you own. That sounds... He seemed to be searching for the word. Genuinely good, actually. She's good people. He stood. She stood. He picked up his hat from the table and turned it in his hands once, the habitual gesture of a man readying to leave. Thank you, he said, for the coffee and for this. Don't thank me for a conversation, she said. That's too small a thing to thank someone for. He almost smiled. Can I thank you for the month's worth of patience it took to get to the conversation? You can acknowledge it internally, she said, and I'll consider that sufficient. He did smile then, the full version of it, and it did what it always did to his face, which was make him look considerably less tired and considerably more like himself, whatever that meant. She was still working out what that meant. She walked him to the door. He stepped out onto the porch, and the October cold came in around him, sharp and clarifying. 2 Saturdays, he said. 2 Saturdays, she confirmed. He put his hat on and walked to his horse and mounted cleanly and turned down the road without looking back, which she appreciated because looking back would have made it into something performative, and she had no patience for performative. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, and then went back inside to the kitchen and the bread that was waiting and the ordinary particular smell of her own house. She took the new apron off the hook, Pia's careful canvas, the double-stitched hem, and tied it on. It was stiff still, not worn in, not yet the soft, familiar weight of her mother's apron. It would take time. Everything took time if it was going to last. But it fit. She went back to the bread. Outside, the copper light of October moved across the prairie, touching everything it reached, and the road that Garrett Mercer had just ridden down was empty and quiet and curving toward the horizon the way good roads do. Not ending anywhere you could see, just continuing on into the distance, which was, if you were in the right state of mind to see it that way, not a lack of destination, but a kind of promise. May Briggs's kitchen smelled like onions and wood smoke and something sweet underneath both of those, and it was approximately the size of a ship's hold, which was fortunate because May had managed to fit 11 people into it by 10 in the morning. Clara had arrived at 8, because that was when May needed her, and also because arriving when you were needed, rather than when it was convenient, was the kind of thing Clara's mother had considered non-negotiable. She'd brought 24 rolls and a jar of the apple butter she'd put up in September, and May had accepted both with the efficient gratitude of a woman who expected competence and was not surprised to find it. The harvest supper was a Briggs tradition going back further than anyone at the table could accurately remember. It happened every October, it fed somewhere between 30 and 50 people depending on the year, and May ran it the way May ran everything, with complete authority and zero tolerance for people standing around looking decorative. Clara was elbow-deep in pie crust when she heard horses outside. She didn't look up. She was at a delicate point. The fat needed to stay cold, and the less she handled the dough, the better. And whoever was arriving could arrive without her watching. Then May came back in from the porch and said to the general room, "Garrett Mercer's here. Somebody put him to work." A brief, specific silence fell over the kitchen. Not long. May's kitchen was not a place where silences were permitted to run long, but present. Clara felt it without looking up from the pastry. Pia, who had come with Rosalie, both of whom Clara had not known would be attending, but was unsurprised to find were, said, "I'll take him," with the cheerful volunteerism of someone who was 19 and found the entire situation interesting rather than complicated. "You'll put him on the potatoes," May said. "They've been sitting since last night and they need someone with some sense." "I'll take him to the potatoes," Pia amended, and went. Clara finished the pie crust. She wrapped it and set it to rest and washed her hands and turned around. Garrett was standing at the far end of the kitchen with a peeling knife in his hand and approximately 30 pounds of potatoes in front of him, looking at the potatoes with the expression of a man who had agreed to something and was now assessing the full scale of what he'd agreed to. Pia was showing him the correct angle for the knife, which he was listening to with more seriousness than the task probably required, which was somehow exactly right. He looked up and found Clara across the kitchen. She gave him a brief, neutral nod and went back to her pies. It was, objectively, a ridiculous situation. The wealthiest rancher in the county standing at a farm kitchen counter peeling potatoes because a widow he was courting had suggested it as a reasonable first occasion. And Clara was aware of the ridiculousness. She was also aware that it was the right call, for reasons she'd understood when she made it, and understood better now that she was watching him peel potatoes with genuine concentration. She didn't want to sit across a table from him while he performed consideration. She didn't want to be walked somewhere scenic and told things that had been prepared. She wanted to see how he was when the situation had no performance value at all, when there was just work and other people and the ordinary friction of being in a room full of people you didn't know who didn't particularly care who you were. She watched, without appearing to watch, for the better part of an hour. He got through the potatoes. He didn't complain about the quantity, which had been considerable. When he finished, he found May, not Pia, not Rosalie, but May directly, and asked what needed doing next. May, who had been regarding him with the assessment she applied to everyone who entered her kitchen, handed him a pot that needed scrubbing and pointed at the yard pump. He took the pot and went. Rosalie appeared at Clara's shoulder. "Potato peeling," she said, not quite neutrally. "May's idea," Clara said. "May's a wise woman. Always has been." Rosalie was quiet for a moment, chopping something with the efficient rhythm of a person who has done a great deal of chopping. "He asked me what your favorite thing to eat was," she said. 3 weeks ago. I thought you should know." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I wasn't his intelligence source, and he'd have to find out himself." A pause. "And then I told him apple butter on fresh bread, because it seemed unkind not to." Clara pressed her lips together to keep from smiling, which didn't entirely work. "Rosalie." "He looked genuinely grateful," Rosalie said unapologetically. "It was a small thing." By noon, the kitchen had reached full productive chaos, the kind that only happens when many competent people are trying to work in the same space and have stopped being polite about reaching past each other. Clara was managing 3 pies and a bread pudding simultaneously and had mostly stopped tracking anyone else in the room. Then May put a bowl of something in front of her and said, "Taste this." And Clara tasted it and said, "More salt, and the pepper needs a minute longer in the fat before you add the broth." And May said, and adjusted, and the conversation was over in 30 seconds. But Garrett had been standing nearby, waiting for a task, and had heard it. "You did that without thinking," he said. "Did what?" The adjustment. You tasted it, and you knew immediately." Clara looked at him. He was genuinely curious, not filling silence. "It's just practice," she said. "It's not just practice. I've had practice at things, and I don't do them like that. Like the information is already in your hands before your brain has finished deciding." She thought about how to explain it. "When you've made enough of something," she said, "you stop cooking with recipes and start cooking with memory. The recipe is the map. The memory is knowing the road." He turned this over. "What happens when you hit a road you haven't traveled? Then you go carefully and you pay attention and you're willing to be wrong before you're right." Is that what the wedding cake was? The wedding cake was a road I'd read about 100 times and never driven. She reached past him for the flower. "It was fine." "It was more than fine. It was good," she said, allowing herself that. "I know when something is good. It was good." He smiled at that. Not the quick, small one, but the fuller version, the one she'd only seen a handful of times. It still did the thing to his face that she hadn't found a good way to be neutral about. She went back to the bread pudding. "Can I ask you something?" he said. He had that careful quality again, choosing whether to go through the door before opening it. "You can ask." "The apron, your mother's. Do you always wear it, or—" He stopped. "I'm asking badly. You're asking why I wore it to the Mercer wedding when Eleanor's comment suggested I knew it would be noticed and judged." Clara didn't look up from the pudding. "Because it was my mother's. Because she made every meal she ever cooked as though it mattered. And I wanted to remember that while I was making the most important meal I'd ever made." She paused. "And because part of me knew that if someone was going to judge it, I wanted to know that about them sooner rather than later." A long pause. "That's," Garrett said, "that's a brave way to do a thing." "It was a practical way," she said. "Brave sounds like I was trying to make a point. I was just trying to make good food and remember where I learned how." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking beside her, which should have been distracting and was somehow not. "My father," he said eventually, "had a pair of boots he wore when he was doing something that mattered to him. Same boots for 20 years. Resold 3 times. My mother kept wanting to throw them out, and he kept saving them." A pause. He wore them the day he signed the deed on the south pasture. The day I was born, apparently, though I can't verify that personally. What happened to them? In his closet. I haven't been able to decide what to do with them. He said it plainly, not with sentiment he wanted noticed, just the plain fact of it. Leave them there, Clara said, until you know. That's what I've been doing. Then you're already doing the right thing. Some decisions make themselves if you give them enough time. He looked at her sideways. Is that what you were doing this month? Giving something time to decide itself? She considered being indirect about this and decided against it. Yes, she said, and watching to see what showed up on the 30th day. And? You showed up on the 30th day, she said. On the dot. She let that sit without adding anything to it, and he let it sit too, and they both went back to what they were doing. The supper itself was loud and warm and ran long, the way May's suppers always ran long, because May believed that a person who left her table still wanting something had been failed by the host. The harvest had been reasonable this year. Not the best anyone could remember, not the worst. And the relief of that was in the room, the particular ease of people who'd been watching weather and worrying about yields for months, and could now sit down and eat without that anxiety sitting at the table with them. Clara sat between May and a woman named Dorothea, who farmed the next property over and had opinions about drainage that she was not shy about sharing. Garrett ended up across the table and 3 seats down, between 2 of the Briggs farmhands who clearly had no idea who he was and were treating him accordingly, which meant they were talking to him about the relative merits of different fence post materials with the focus of men who cared about this question. He was holding his own. She could see him asking questions, genuine ones, not the polite questions of a man waiting for the subject to change. One of the farmhands pulled out a piece of paper and started drawing a diagram, and Garrett leaned over to look at it and said something that made the man laugh. And Clara turned back to Dorothea and her drainage opinions and felt something settle a little further. May, who noticed everything, said quietly, close to Clara's ear, "He peeled 30 pounds of potatoes without being asked twice. That's character." "May," Clara said. "I'm 71 years old," May said. "I've run out of time to be indirect about things." She picked up her fork. "He looks at you like you're a person." "Most people look at other people like they're people." "No, they don't." May said it with the certainty of someone who had watched a great many people looking at a great many other people over 7 decades. Most people look at each other like they're a role: widow, rancher, cook, rich man, poor woman. They see the category and they stop there. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, toward the far end of the table. "He looks past the category. That's harder to find than it sounds." Clara didn't say anything to that. She ate her supper, but she thought about it, and she knew May was right. And knowing May was right moved something in her that had been very carefully staying still. The evening ended the way good evenings end, gradually, without a clear moment where it stopped being one thing and started being another. People drifted toward coats and horses. Dishes were cleared. May accepted thanks with the gracious efficiency of a woman who had done this many times and considered it correctly handled. Clara was wrapping leftover rolls. She always brought slightly too many, which May always kept, which was the arrangement, when Garrett appeared beside her. "I'll walk out with you," he said, "if that's all right." "It's all right," she said. They went out through the side door into the November night. It was November now, just barely, the month having turned 2 days ago. And the air was sharp enough to be uncomfortable and clear enough that you could see a long way across the open land. Their horses were near each other at the post, Clara's old horse and Garrett's better one, standing companionably the way horses sometimes did. "Tell me something," Garrett said, not starting toward the horses yet. "Again? It was a good question last time." She thought about it. "When I was learning to make bread," she said, "really learning it, not just doing it, I ruined something like 40 batches before I made one I was satisfied with. 40 batches is a lot of flour when you're counting your flour." "What kept you going?" "The 39th batch was better than the 38th. She looked out at the dark land. "Not good, not right, but better. And I thought, if 38 to 39 moved that much, then 39 to 40 might too." A pause. "It did. And 40 was the one. 40 was the first one I wasn't embarrassed by," she said. "The good ones came later, but 40 was when I understood that I was going to figure it out. He was quiet for a moment. I think I've been waiting to be at 40, he said, without doing enough 39s. That's a very honest thing to say. You have a way of making honesty seem like the obvious choice. He said it without flattery, just as an observation, the way he made observations. I just don't have the energy for the alternative, she said. Dishonesty is exhausting. You have to remember too much. He laughed, and it came out clean and real in the cold night air. They stood there for a moment, not moving toward the horses yet, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. The dark around them was the good kind of dark. Not threatening, just vast, the ordinary enormity of the prairie at night. I'd like to bring you something next time, Bissem, he said. If there is a next time. Apple butter on bread seemed like, Rosalie told me. I know she told you, Clara said. She told me she told you. Did that bother you? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. It made me think that Rosalie trusts you, and Rosalie doesn't trust people lightly. She paused. It also told me you were asking, that mattered. The asking. The fact that you wanted to know something specific, not just something general and easy. She turned toward the horses. A lot of people ask questions to fill space. You asked because you wanted to know. He walked beside her to the post. What's the answer? He said. Favorite thing to eat. Rosalie was right, she said. She untied her horse and checked the knee out of habit. But the bread matters almost as much as the apple butter, the combination of them. She mounted carefully. Thomas used to say I was the only person he knew who made food taste better in pairs than on their own. She said it, and then was briefly surprised by having said it. She didn't bring Thomas into conversations often, didn't offer him up as reference material. But it had come out naturally, the way things came out when you weren't managing them. Garrett was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just giving the moment its right amount of room. He sounds like he paid attention, he said. He did, she said. He was good at attention. She looked at Garrett across the short distance between their horses. In the dark. In the cold. At the end of a Saturday that had been exactly what she'd hoped it would be. Ordinary and revealing and without any particular drama. Come for bread next Saturday, she said. I'll have a fresh batch in the morning. You can bring the apple butter if you want something to do with your hands on the ride. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, nothing she could have described in precise terms. Just the look of a man who had been given something real and knew it. I'll bring the apple butter, he said. Good, she said. Early is better. The bread's best in the first hour. She turned her horse toward the road and started home. And the cold came with her, and the stars overhead were doing their usual work. And she rode the 4 miles back through the dark, thinking about 39 batches, and the 40th, and the one after that, and the one after that. All the incremental, unglamorous, necessary work of getting something right. Her mother had told her once, embroidering by lamplight with the reading glasses she hated, that the things worth keeping were always the things you built slowly, that fast things were exciting and sometimes valuable, but they were rarely the ones that held. Clara had been maybe 12 years old when she heard that. She'd been impatient with it at the time. 12-year-olds were not, as a rule, interested in the virtues of slowness. She understood it now, in the way you understand things that took years to arrive at, riding home through the Wyoming dark with her horse's bad knee holding steady under her and a Saturday morning ahead of her that she was, for the first time in a long time, looking forward to without qualification. Some things got built slowly. That was not a flaw in them. That was how they lasted. He came the next Saturday with the apple butter, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. It became, without either of them formally declaring it to be anything, a thing. Saturday mornings at Clara's kitchen table, bread in the first hour while it was best. Apple butter from the jar he brought, and she put on the shelf between visits. He arrived early because she'd said early was better, and she had the bread ready because she'd said she would, and they sat across from each other in the small kitchen and talked the way people talk when they're not performing conversation, stopping mid-thought, contradicting themselves, occasionally sitting in silence that didn't require filling. He was not a smooth man, up close and over time. He repeated certain phrases when he was working through something. He had a habit of straightening objects on the table, cups, spoons, the salt dish, when he was uncomfortable, which he probably didn't know he was doing. He held opinions firmly and changed them slowly. And when he changed them, he said so directly, without the kind of elaborate justification that men sometimes constructed to make changing their minds look like it had been their intention all along. That part she respected. She was not easy either. She knew this about herself with the clarity of a woman who had lived alone long enough to see her own edges. She was impatient with inefficiency. She could go long stretches in her own head without surfacing, which people sometimes read as coldness, and was not coldness but was also, she acknowledged, not particularly warm in effect. She had a way of ending conversations by simply having nothing more to say on the subject, which Thomas had learned to read correctly, and which Garrett was learning gradually to read the same way. Not rejection, just completion. They were not easy together. They were honest together, which was harder and better. November moved into December. December brought snow. The order that changed things came on a Wednesday in the second week of December, delivered by a man on a good horse who handed Clara a letter and waited while she read it. It was from a hotel in the nearest large town, a proper hotel, 3 floors, the kind that served dinner to traveling businessmen and visiting officials. The manager had heard about the Mercer wedding feast from 3 different guests who had been there. He was looking to bring in a contracted baker and cook for his dining room. Weekly quantities, fixed payment, the option to expand the arrangement if the initial period went well. The payment he named was more than Clara had earned in any full month of the past 3 years. She stood on her porch in the December cold and read the letter twice, and the man on the horse waited, and she said, "Tell him I'll come Tuesday to discuss terms." She sent Garrett a message that afternoon, not through Rosalie, through Connell at the larder, who was a reliable conduit and understood discretion, asking if he could come that evening rather than Saturday. He arrived at 5. She handed him the letter. He read it. He set it on the table. He looked at her. "This is a significant offer," he said. "I know. It would mean weekly trips to town, more production than your current setup can handle without changes." "I know that too." "Are you going to take it?" She'd been thinking about this all day, turning it over the way she turned things that mattered, looking at it from each angle before committing to a view. "I think yes," she said. "But I want to talk through the logistics before I go Tuesday. The production capacity is the constraint. My kitchen is big enough for what I do now, not for what this would require." He nodded. "What would you need?" "A better oven. The one I have is good, but it's not built for commercial volume. And I'd need to expand the cold room. What I have now won't hold the quantity of finished goods for weekly delivery." She paused. "I've been thinking about it since noon. I can cover the oven from what I have saved. The cold room expansion is the problem." He was quiet for a moment. His hand moved to straighten the salt dish, which she now recognized as his thinking gesture. "I could help with the cold room," he said. She looked at him steadily. "That's not what I'm asking." "I know you're not asking." He met her eyes. "I'm offering. Those are different things." A pause. "You said that to me once, actually, in almost exactly those words." She had. About the Mercer job. "I need the work." That's different from being happy about it. She hadn't expected him to remember the specific phrasing. "If I let you fund the expansion," she said carefully, "I need it to be a loan. Terms in writing, interest if you insist, though I'll argue against it." "I don't want interest." "I'll pay interest anyway. I don't want there to be any confusion about what this is and isn't." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, and lived, she thought, somewhere productively between the two. "You're the most determined person I've ever met about not accepting help." "I'm determined about accepting help on terms I can respect," she corrected. "There's a difference." "There always is with you," he said, but he said it without complaint, more like a man noting something he'd come to understand and had made his peace with. "Loan," she said. "Written terms. Repayment within 18 months. 12, he said. "If the hotel contract goes the way it looks like it will, you'll clear it in 12. Don't set yourself a longer timeline than you need." She considered this. He was right, which was slightly annoying. 12 months, she said. "Written down." "Written down," he agreed. She made more coffee, and they spent the next hour going through the practical questions. The oven specifications, the cold room dimensions, what the hotel would likely require, and what she could realistically produce. He asked good questions. He didn't try to take the problem over, which had been her concern. He stayed in the lane of a useful second mind without crossing into the lane of a man who had decided he knew better. When it was done, she felt clearer. Not certain. Certainty before Tuesday would have been dishonest, but clearer. "Thank you," she said. "For what? You did the thinking. I just asked questions." "That's what I'm thanking you for," she said. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a neutral moment usually lasted. "Clara," he said. She waited. He was doing the thing where he found the right words before he used them. She'd learned to give him time for this, because what came out when she gave him time was usually worth the wait. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "You'd find it suspicious if I did." "Probably," she agreed. "But I want to say this. The last 2 months. Coming here on Saturdays, the Briggs supper tonight. I want you to know that this is—" He stopped. "I'm not good at this particular kind of sentence." "I know," she said. "You're doing fine. I'm trying to say that it matters to me. That you matter to me. Not as someone to fix a situation or fill a space, as yourself. The specific, particular, frequently exasperating person you actually are." "Frequently exasperating," she repeated. "I mean that as a compliment. I know you do." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The lamp threw warm light across the table between them, and the snow was coming down outside, and the stove was keeping the room exactly warm enough, not warmer. "It matters to me too," she said. "You should know that. I don't have a speech either, but I want to say it plainly so there's no confusion." "There isn't," he said. "No confusion." "Good." They finished the coffee. He left before it got too late because the snow was coming heavier, and the road home wanted daylight, or at least a moon, and tonight there was neither. She stood at the door and watched him ride out, and then went back inside to bank the stove. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment before she did it. "It matters to me, too." She'd said it plainly. She'd meant it plainly. That was the most she could offer right now, and she thought, she believed, that he understood the difference between "it matters to me" and "I am ready for everything that comes after this." She was not ready for everything that came after, but she was somewhere on the road toward it, and the road was real, and she was moving. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. Shem. The hotel meeting on Tuesday went well. Better than well. The manager was a practical man who wanted results, and she was a practical woman who could deliver them, and they understood each other quickly, which made everything else easier. She came home with a signed contract and took it out and read it 3 times at her kitchen table, and then folded it and put it in the tin box on the shelf above the stove, the tin box where she'd once kept $31 and a lot of fear. The cold room expansion happened in January, managed by a carpenter from town who knew his work. She supervised every stage of it, and the carpenter, initially resistant to supervision from a woman, came around by the second day when it became apparent that she knew exactly what she needed and why. By the third day, he was consulting her on material choices, which she considered a reasonable outcome. Garrett came to look at it when it was finished. He stood in the expanded cold room and looked at the shelving she'd had built and the improved insulation and said, "It's well done." "It is," she said. "He does good work. So do you." He touched the new shelving, the solid fit of it. "You designed this." I told him what I needed. "That's designing it." He turned around and looked at her. "First payment in April?" "First payment in March," she said. "I'm ahead of schedule." He shook his head, but he was close to smiling. "Of course you are." The winter went on. The bread went to the hotel every week. The hotel's dining room noticed. More orders came, and then more. The tin box above the stove filled and emptied and filled again in a different rhythm. Not the frantic checking and rechecking of 3 years ago, not the daily calculation of whether there was enough, but the steadier movement of a business that had found its footing. She hired Pia in February. Part-time at first, 3 mornings a week. Pia arrived each morning with more enthusiasm than was strictly necessary at 5:30 a.m. and turned out to be a better assistant than Clara had anticipated, which meant she'd anticipated correctly because she'd watched Pia work and she trusted her own observations. "You don't need to check everything I do," Pia said one morning, 2 weeks in, not combatively, just stating a fact. "I know," Clara said. "I'm not checking because I doubt you. I'm watching because I'm figuring out how you work." "What's the difference?" One of them is about trust, and one of them is about learning, Claire said. I trust you. I'm still learning how you think. Pia considered this with the seriousness of someone who was 19 and had not yet developed the habit of brushing off things that deserved consideration. Okay, she said. That makes sense. After I've learned how you think, Clara said, I won't need to watch as closely. And then you'll trust me with the more complicated things? Then I'll give you the more complicated things and see what you do with them, Clara said. Trust is the beginning. Competence is what you build with it. Pia was quiet for a moment, measuring something. That's how you work, isn't it? She said. With everyone. You give people the smaller thing first and watch what happens. Clara looked at her. Yes, she said. Is that a problem? No. Pia turned back to the bread she was shaping. It makes sense. I see it now. A pause. Is that what you did with Mr. Mercer? Give him the smaller thing first? I told him to come to May's harvest supper and peel potatoes, Clara said. Pia burst out laughing. Real laughter, the kind that couldn't be managed. That was a test? It was information, Clara said. I didn't need him to pass anything. I just needed to see something true. And the potatoes were true. The potatoes, Clara said, with complete seriousness, were very true. He asked her to marry him in April, not on a planned occasion, not with anything staged. He came on a Saturday morning the way he always came, and the bread was ready the way it always was. And they were sitting at the table with the first hour's loaf between them and the apple butter open, and he said, without preface, looking at her directly, I want to marry you. I want to say that plainly before I lose my nerve. Clara set down her knife. She looked at him. He looked back, a little tense around the jaw, which was the only place he ever showed nerves. You're not losing your nerve, she said. Not yet, he said. But I've been working up to saying that since February, and if I don't say it now, I'm going to run out of road. She turned the knife over on the table. She did not look away from him. You understand what you're asking, she said. Not the asking itself. I know you understand that. I mean, everything that comes after. I'm not easy. I've told you that. You've demonstrated it comprehensively, he said. That's not a complaint. I work early and I work long, and I have opinions about how things should be done that are not negotiable, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I will not apologize for it. I know. And She stopped. This was harder. I'm still working out what I am. After Thomas. After the last 3 years, I know who I've been during them. I don't fully know yet who I'm going to be after. She looked at the bread on the table. I don't want to marry you and then discover there were things I needed to do first. He was quiet for a moment. What things? I don't know, she said honestly. That's the problem. He nodded slowly, not defeated, just thinking. Can I ask you something? Yes. In the months we've been doing this, the Saturdays, the evenings, the cold room, May's supper, have you ever felt like you had to stop being yourself? She thought about it, really thought. No, she said. Have you ever felt like I needed you to be different than you are? No. Then whatever you need to figure out, he said. I'm not the thing that's stopping you from figuring it out. Am I? She looked at him for a long moment. At this man with his straightened salt dishes and his even voice and his 30-day count and his potatoes at May Briggs's harvest supper. No, she said. You're not. Then maybe figure it out with me here, he said. Not instead of me. With me. I'm not asking you to have everything settled. I'm asking you to let me be in the room while you work through it. A pause. I'm good at being in a room without getting in the way. You said so yourself. She had said so. First morning at the ranch kitchen. You're not in the way if you stand over there. Something in her chest that had been carefully managing its own temperature for a very long time shifted, just slightly, toward warmth, toward something less managed. Yes, she said. He went very still for a second. Yes? Yes, she said again, cleaner this time. I'll marry you. He exhaled, a long, real breath that told her exactly how much the last 5 minutes had cost him, which she found, unexpectedly, more moving than anything else about the moment. He had been afraid. He had said the thing anyway. That was the thing she'd been watching for since October, and here it was, real and imperfect and enough. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the morning kitchen with the bread going cool between them and the spring light coming through the window, and neither of them saying anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying right now that wasn't already being said by the two of them sitting together in the ordinary warmth of an ordinary morning. They married in the second week of May, when the prairie was doing what the Wyoming prairie rarely did, being genuinely beautiful, the grass coming in green and the sky a hard clear blue and the air smelling of things growing. It was a small ceremony, not because either of them was ashamed of anything, but because neither of them was interested in performance. May Briggs came, and Rosalie and Pia and Connell from the larder, who came and said nothing for the duration and clapped with the rest. Helen Pratt came and brought her husband and sat in the third row with the expression of a woman who was satisfied that an outcome had been correctly reached. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself over the winter, from fabric she'd chosen because she liked it rather than because it was expected. It was a deep blue-green, the color of river water in late afternoon. It was not a traditional bridal color. She was aware of this and did not find it concerning. Under the dress, tied at her waist, she wore her mother's apron. Nobody could see it. That wasn't the point. The point was that it was there, the small embroidered flowers against her skin, her mother's patient, careful work present in the room, the way the dead are sometimes present. Not as ghosts, not as absences, but as the accumulated weight of what they taught you and who they made you. Rosalie saw her tie it on in the back room before the ceremony. She looked at it and looked at Clara and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She'd have liked him?" "She would have made him peel something," Clara said, "to see what he was made of." And he would have peeled it," Clara said, "and asked someone how to do it better." Rosalie made a sound that was probably, in Rosalie's register, a laugh. When Clara walked in, Garrett was standing at the front of the room looking at the door. And when she came through it, something in his face went very simple and very clear. Not theatrical, not the expression of a man playing a moment, just a man looking at a woman walking toward him, and something in him quietly settling into place. She walked to him and stood beside him, and they got married, plainly and honestly, with May crying in the second row because May was 71 and had earned the right to cry at weddings, and Pia trying not to cry and failing, and Rosalie not crying and also not pretending she might. Afterward there was food, because of course there was food. Clara had arranged it herself a month ago in the hours she spent planning the way she planned everything. Good food, honest food, the kind that didn't announce itself but made people feel cared for in the eating of it. May brought cornbread. Of course May brought cornbread. Clara stood at the edge of the room at one point in the middle of the afternoon and looked at the people gathered in it and let herself feel it without managing it, the simple, complicated fact of having arrived here from where she'd started. From the graveside in the rain and the $31 and the bread that needed tending. From the back door and the invisible week and her name being said out loud in front of 200 people who had not known to say it before. She was not the woman she'd been at 26. She was not the woman she'd been last October either, sitting on the floor of the Mercer Ranch kitchen with cold coffee and flour in her hair. She was something she was still becoming, which was, she had decided, exactly the right state to be in. Garrett found her at the edge of the room. He came and stood beside her the way he'd learned to stand beside her, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it completely, with none of the qualifications she usually applied to statements of that size. "Good," he said. He handed her a plate. "Connell brought something from the larder. He says it's a wedding gift, but I think he just didn't know what else to bring." "That's exactly what it is," she said. "He's a practical man. Like someone else I know." "Don't," she said, but she was smiling, and he knew the difference. They stood there together in the room full of people they actually knew and actually liked, and ate from the plate between them, and outside the May prairie was green and ridiculous with optimism, the way spring always was. And inside the room was warm and loud and real. Years later, not many years, but enough for the edges to soften and the good parts to settle into the permanent record, Clara would think about what the difference was between the life she'd had before and the life she had after, and she would not think about the dramatic things. The wedding that fell apart, The name said out loud in the hall. The 30-day wait on a dark road. She would think about the bread, about arriving at the 40th batch, about the fact that the good things she had come to have were not the product of one right decision, but of 100 small ones. Taking the job, enduring the back entrance, saying the true thing when she could have said the easy thing, asking for written terms, peel testing a man at a harvest supper. She would think about her mother's kitchen and the idea that every meal should be made as though it mattered. She had inherited this belief so young, she sometimes forgot it was something she'd been taught rather than something she'd always known. But it was taught. Someone had shown her by doing it every day for years that what you made with your hands said something about what you believed the people around you deserved. She had spent her life trying to make food that said, "You deserve something real." What she'd learned, slower and harder, was that the same principle applied to everything else. The life that held was built the same way as the bread that was finally right. Not quickly, not without failure, not without the specific exhaustion of trying and adjusting and trying again. Built with attention, built from the inside out, built to last. On a Saturday morning in June, a month after the wedding, Clara came downstairs to find Garrett already in the kitchen. He had not made coffee because he did not entirely trust himself with her stove, which was a sensible position, and she had told him so. But he had laid out the bread she'd shaped the night before and had built up the fire the way she'd shown him, and the kitchen was warm. He was straightening the salt dish. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. This imperfect, honest, potato-peeling man in her kitchen, in her life, with his habitual nervous gesture and his way of being in a room without taking it over. "You're going to move that thing back to center, and then 1 millimeter past, and then back again," she said. For about 4 more minutes. He looked up. "How did you know?" "You always do it when something's on your mind." She came into the kitchen and went to the stove. "What is it?" "Nothing bad," he said. "Just—" He set the salt dish down, deliberately, in whatever position it was in. "I was thinking that I'm glad I came on the 30th day." "The 30th day," she said, putting the coffee on. "I thought about coming on the 28th. I thought 28 was close enough." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Why didn't you?" "Because you said a month," he said, "and you meant a month. And I had gotten as far as understanding that when you said something you meant it, and that taking it seriously was the minimum I could offer." He paused. "Also, I was afraid that if I came 2 days early, you'd send me home." "I would have," she said. "I know." 30 days. 30 days, he said. "Worth every one." Eat. She turned back to the stove and the coffee and the morning coming in through the window. The particular light of a June day in Wyoming, which was as close to generous as that country usually got. Behind her she heard him settle at the table, and the small sound of the salt dish being set down and left alone. The bread was ready. She brought it to the table, and the apple butter and the coffee, and she sat down across from him in her kitchen, in her house, in the life she had built out of $31 and hard work, and the knowledge that the things worth having were the things you built one careful layer at a time. Outside, Red Creek Crossing was waking up. Somewhere down the road, Connell was opening the larder. May Briggs was probably already in her kitchen. Pia would be at Clara's bakehouse in an hour, slightly too enthusiastic for 5:30 a.m., which Clara had come to depend on more than she'd expected. The world was ordinary and real, and this morning, more than enough. Clara Hawthorne, Clara Mercer. Now, though she kept Hawthorne for the business because it was the name people knew and names mattered, poured the coffee and cut the bread and pushed the apple butter across the table. And the morning began the way good mornings begin. Without ceremony, without announcement, just the quiet and solid fact of it. That was, in the end, what she'd worked toward all along. Not to be seen, not to be saved, not to be applauded, though the applause had come. Just this. Just the ordinary weight of a real life, made carefully, held well. Just this.
Where the fuck is the fucking beehive?
Gone, I guess.
Did they change it to where it has to be inside now?
Kind of like having Chandler as my guide. Oh, a coffee mug. Hello?
Hello.
Something spawned right here. It's not good. Oh, it's the only way forward, so. Chris City, how are you? Oh, wait, welcome back. Been a while. How are you? What was that? Oh, whoa. Okay. Oh.
Right is a dead end.
Oh, is it? Okay. There's a turret up here. Oh no. Oh god. Zerty the plants.
Oh, there's a turret.
There's a turret and there's plants. Whoa.
Is it the like cancer ones or?
Yes, if you don't breathe, don't stand in the fucking spores too long or you turn into a monster.
Oh, okay.
We gotta go this way though, it's the only way forward. Or maybe that way is forward as well. Well, we'll tank some plant. A little bit of plant won't hurt you, won't kill you. That's a lot of plant. That is a lot of plant. Ooh. Like a fucking tank here though. I'll come back for that. Ben? Is the plants growing? Yeah, how about fuck that? And there's a spider. How about fuck that too?
Hey.
All plants that way, bro.
The apparatus is across the jump.
I'm gonna start depoting. Maybe you... we should grab it, I don't know. Let's hope this bridge holds up, am I right or am I right? It should be strong enough to hold up. I'm just holding one item. Just in case. 37 pounds? That too much? Seems okay to me. Oh. Well, that didn't work. Hey, Trevi. How are you? Whoa.
Straight? No, don't go there. Straight.